The girl's scream about the pain in her private parts made her mother rush to check, only to find blood, a sight that froze her in terror. "Mama, it hurts." Amina's voice sliced through the stillness of the house like a blade. She stood in the hallway, clutching the waistband of her pajama pants, her face a mask of confusion and fear. The silence following her words was broken only by the clinking of empty bottles rolling across the floor in Nia's bedroom. Nia lay sprawled on her bed, tangled in sheets, the acrid stench of stale alcohol filling the room, mingling with the scent of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke. The television flickered in the background, playing to an audience long since tuned out. She barely noticed Amina's presence, her mind dulled by the remnants of last night's bender. "Mama, please." Amina's voice wavered, her small body trembling. "It hurts down there." Nia forced herself to focus, blinking against the harsh light streaming through the curtains, her head pounding with each heartbeat, a painful reminder of the liquor she had guzzled to drown her memories. Memories of a husband who had walked out, leaving the life they were supposed to have behind. She turned her blurry eyes toward her daughter, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Amina," Nia groaned, rolling her eyes, "not this again." Her voice was thick, slurred. "You always make things up for attention." "But it really hurts." "Mama," Amina cried, her voice wavering. "Enough." Nia's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and unforgiving. "I've got enough to deal with without your drama." She waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing away an annoying fly, then reached for the half-empty bottle on her nightstand. The amber liquid sloshed inside, taunting her with promises of forgetfulness. Amina's face crumpled, her mother's indifference stinging more than the pain gnawing at her insides. She bit her lip, fighting back sobs, and with a quiet nod, turned and shuffled down the hallway, her small frame dwarfed by the shadows that loomed in the silent house. Nia watched her go, a momentary pang of guilt twisting in her chest, but it was quickly swallowed by the wave of self-pity that swept over her. She tossed back the drink, the liquid burning a path down her throat. She needed this, needed to forget, even if only for a little while. Needed to lose herself in the haze of alcohol and fleeting encounters that numbed her pain, if only temporarily. Days turned into a blur of empty bottles and unfamiliar faces. Nia came and went at odd hours, leaving Amina alone in the house for days on end. She stumbled through the door one evening, the smell of a man's cologne clinging to her clothes, her mind fogged with the aftereffects of her nightly escapades. The apartment was eerily quiet, and Amina was nowhere in sight. Nia barely noticed. She collapsed on the couch, already reaching for the bottle she had stashed behind the cushions. It wasn't until the next morning that she heard faint whimpers coming from the bathroom. Nia groaned, rolling over and blinking against the harsh sunlight filtering through the blinds. The sound grew louder, more insistent, each sob like a knife twisting in her gut. She dragged herself off the couch, her movements slow and unsteady, and made her way to the bathroom. She pushed the door open and froze. The sight before her was enough to sober her instantly. Amina was curled up on the cold tile floor, her pajama pants soaked through with blood. It pooled around her, staining the white porcelain of the toilet a dark crimson. The smell was sickening, a mix of iron and something else, something wrong. Amina, Nia's voice broke as she dropped to her knees beside her daughter. Amina's face was pale, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. Nia's hands shook as she reached out, unsure where to touch or what to do. "Mama," Amina's voice was barely a whisper, a ghost of sound above the roaring in Nia's ears. It hurts." "Oh God," Nia's voice trembled as she scooped the limp child into her arms, the warmth of the blood seeping through her clothes. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't afford to break down now. She had to get Amina to the hospital. Nia fumbled with the car keys, her hands shaking so violently that she could barely fit the key into the ignition. "Hold on, baby," she whispered as the engine roared to life. "Hold on." She drove like a madwoman, running red lights and ignoring the blaring horns of angry drivers. They arrived at the hospital, and nurses rushed to take Amina from her arms. Nia stood there, numb and hollow, as they whisked her daughter away. She was left with nothing but the cold, sterile waiting room, and the crushing weight of her own failure. Her knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. She had done this. She had done this. She had let it come to this. Hours later, Nia sat in the cold, sterile hospital room. Her eyes fixed on the pale figure of Amina lying on the bed. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. Nia's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. Her mind was a swirling vortex of guilt and fear, each wave crashing over her more violently than the last. How had it come to this? How had she let it get this bad? She watched as the nurses worked around her daughter, their faces set in expressions of professional calm, but Nia could see the worry etched in the lines around their eyes. They whispered to one another, glancing at the machines, at Amina, at her. She could feel their unspoken questions, their judgment, and she welcomed it. She deserved every bit of it. A doctor entered the room, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair, and a look of grim determination. He glanced at Nia before turning his attention to Amina. "We need to move quickly," he said to the nurse. "Prepare her for a transfusion. She's lost a lot of blood." Nia's heart lurched. "Lost a lot of blood?" she echoed, her voice weak and trembling. The doctor finally looked at her, his eyes hard. "Yes, ma'am, a significant amount. We need to stabilize her immediately." Nia nodded numbly, her throat tightening. She wanted to ask so many questions, but the words wouldn't come. She watched as they hooked Amina up to more machines, inserted IVs, and took yet another blood sample. Her little girl was so still, so quiet. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Why didn't you bring her in sooner? The doctor's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. His words were cold, clinical, but beneath them, Nia heard the accusation, the disbelief. "It didn't happen overnight." I didn't know," Nia stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't know?" The doctor shook his head, turning back to his work. "She's been bleeding internally. The pain must have been excruciating." Nia's heart sank, the reality of the situation hitting her like a freight train. Amina had been in agony and she had ignored it. More than that, she had dismissed it. Her mind flashed back to those days and nights when she had chosen a bottle over her daughter's pleas. When she had lost herself in strangers' arms while Amina lay in bed alone, suffering in silence. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought back to the days when Amina was her whole world, before the drinking, before her husband had walked out. There was a time when she had lived for bedtime stories, when Amina's laughter had been the music that filled their home. But then he left. Her husband, Amina's father, had walked out without so much as a goodbye. He had left a gaping hole in their lives, and Nia had fallen into it, dragging her daughter along with her. Somehow, in her pain, she had blamed Amina. It was irrational, cruel even, but she had seen her daughter's face and felt the sting of betrayal, the bitterness of abandonment. And so she had shut herself off, drowning her sorrows in drink and fleeting comfort. She had become a stranger to her own child. Now, as she looked at Amina's frail form on the bed, the reality of her failure hit her with full force. Her daughter had needed her, and she had turned her back. The guilt was a crushing weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The doctor's voice brought her back to the present. "If you had waited any longer to bring her in, we might have lost her," he said bluntly, no attempt to soften the blow. "You're lucky she's still with us." Lucky. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. She reached out and took Amina's small, cold hand in hers. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The tears came then, hot and uncontrollable, streaming down her face as she sobbed. Amina's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, her gaze meeting Nia's. In that split second, Nia saw the confusion, the pain, and worst of all, the fear. Fear that shouldn't be there. Fear that no child should feel toward their own mother. Amina's eyes closed again, too weak to stay open, and Nia felt her heart shatter. The room grew quiet again as the nurses finished their work and left. Nia sat alone with her daughter, the hum of the machines and the occasional beep of the monitors the only sounds that filled the void. She should have been there. She should have listened. How many nights had she stumbled through the door too drunk to notice the way Amina flinched when she moved? How many times had she pushed her away, ignoring the signs that something was terribly wrong? The doctor returned, a clipboard in hand, his face as grave as before. "We're doing everything we can," he said, Not unkindly, but there was a distance in his eyes. He didn't trust her, and she didn't blame him. "We need to run more tests to figure out what's causing this." Nia nodded, wiping at her tears with a shaking hand. "Whatever it takes," she choked out. "Please, just help her." He gave a curt nod and left, leaving Nia to sit with her thoughts, her regrets. Amina woke up the next morning, her eyes fluttering open like fragile petals unfurling in the first light of dawn. Nia was at her side immediately, her heart leaping with a mixture of hope and fear. But the hope quickly faded as Amina winced, a low moan escaping her lips. The pain hadn't left. "Hey, sweetheart," Nia whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. She gently brushed a strand of hair from Amina's damp forehead. "How are you feeling?" Amina's response was barely a murmur. "It still hurts, Mama." Nia bit her lip, nodding as she swallowed the lump that formed in her throat. She wanted to be strong for her daughter, to offer her some semblance of comfort, but the truth was, she was terrified. For the past several days, doctors had been poking and prodding, running tests that seemed to go on forever, but with no answers. And with each passing hour, Amina seemed to slip further away, the light in her eyes dimming, replaced by the dull sheen of constant pain. A nurse entered the room, offering a tight-lipped smile as she took Amina's vitals. Nia watched her go through the motions, each step methodical, each action precise. The nurses had been kind, and the doctors diligent, but none of them could give her what she so desperately needed: an answer. A reason for why her daughter was suffering. Later that afternoon, a team of doctors came in to discuss Amina's condition. They spoke in hushed tones, using words that made Nia's head spin, terms like idiopathic and inconclusive. They threw around possibilities, mentioning rare disorders and uncommon diseases, but each theory was dismissed as quickly as it was presented. "I'm afraid we still don't have a definitive diagnosis," the lead doctor said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Her symptoms are unusual. We've run a full panel of tests, but the results are inconclusive." "Inconclusive?" Nia echoed, her voice rising. "How can you not know what's wrong with her? She's in pain, can't you see that?" The doctor sighed, his eyes betraying the helplessness he felt. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Chikwi. Sometimes these things take time." "Time?" Nia snapped, her voice cracking. "Time is the one thing she doesn't have. Every day she gets worse. Every day," her voice broke, and she turned away, unable to finish the sentence. She couldn't bear to say it out loud, to give voice to the fear that gnawed at her every waking moment. As the doctors left, Nia sank into the chair beside Amina's bed, her body trembling with suppressed emotion. She watched her daughter, her beautiful little girl who used to run through the park, her laughter ringing out like bells, now reduced to this pale, fragile creature. She had trusted the hospital, trusted that they would have answers. But all they had were excuses and empty reassurances. It was late in the evening when Nia's old friend Zola came to visit. Zola had heard about Amina's condition and came to offer her support. They sat in the hospital cafeteria, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on their faces. "How is she?" Zola asked gently. "No better," Nia replied, rubbing her temples. "They have no idea what's wrong with her. They keep saying they need more time, but I don't know how much more time she has." Zola hesitated, her gaze dropping to the cup of coffee in her hands. "You know," she began slowly, "I have a friend who swears by this local healer. A sort of spiritual guide, I guess you could say." Nia stared at her, incredulous. "A healer? You mean like a witch doctor?" "Not exactly," Zola said quickly. "More like a traditional healer. She's helped a lot of people when doctors couldn't. I know it sounds crazy, but maybe it's worth a shot." Nia wanted to dismiss the idea outright. She wasn't a superstitious person, and the thought of taking Amina to some back-alley shaman seemed ludicrous. But then she thought of the doctors' faces, the way they looked at her with pity and resignation. The way they had no answers. Could it really hurt to try something different? Desperation clawed at her. She couldn't just sit here, doing nothing, while her daughter wasted away. "Fine," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine, let's try it." The next day, against the doctor's advice, Nia signed Amina out of the hospital. She ignored their warnings, their insistence that Amina needed to stay for observation. Nia had heard enough of their empty platitudes. She needed action. She needed hope. Zola drove them out of town into the countryside where the healer lived. The house was a ramshackle affair, tucked away in the woods, half hidden by overgrown trees and tangled vines. It looked more like a place from a horror movie than a sanctuary of healing, but Nia pressed on, carrying Amina in her arms. Her daughter was too weak to walk, her head resting against Nia's shoulder. As they approached the door, an old woman answered, her eyes sharp and knowing, as if she could see straight into Nia's soul. She ushered them inside without a word, leading them to a room filled with the heavy scent of burning sage. Candles flickered on every surface, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and strange symbols were drawn in chalk on the floor. Nia felt a shiver run down her spine as the woman began to prepare for the ritual. She spread out a circle of salt on the ground and instructed Nia to place Amina in the center. Reluctantly, Nia obeyed, watching as the woman moved with practiced precision, setting up bowls of herbs, oils, and strange talismans around the circle. The woman began to chant in a language Nia didn't understand, her voice low and melodic, rising and falling like the cadence of a long-forgotten prayer. She sprinkled herbs into the air, filling the room with an earthy, pungent aroma that made Nia's head swim. Amina lay motionless in the center of the circle, her eyes closed, her breath shallow. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the candle flames leaped higher, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the walls. The woman produced a small vial of dark liquid and held it over Amina, allowing a few drops to fall onto her forehead. The liquid spread, glistening in the candlelight like fresh blood. Nia's heart pounded in her chest. This was madness. She should stop this, take Amina and run. But she was rooted to the spot, held there by a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, this would work. That this strange ritual could do what modern medicine could not. The woman reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out a bundle of feathers tied together with red string. She waved it over Amina's body, muttering incantations under her breath. Nia watched, her breath caught in her throat, as the woman's eyes rolled back, her voice becoming a guttural growl. It was as if she was communing with something beyond, something ancient and powerful. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, a pulsating rhythm that matched the beat of Nia's own frantic heart. Amina stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Nia's eyes widened, her hands clenching at her sides. Was it working? Was this bizarre ritual actually doing something? Finally, the woman ceased her chanting, her eyes snapping back into focus. She looked at Nia, her expression inscrutable. "The child has been cleansed," she said, her voice raspy and tired. Nia rushed to Amina's side, her hands trembling as she touched her daughter's face. Amina's eyes fluttered open, a faint flicker of awareness in their depths. "Mama," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," baby Nia murmured, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm right here." But even as she held her daughter, even as she clung to the hope that this ritual had done something, a cold knot of doubt settled in her stomach. The healer had said the pain was gone. They drove back home in silence. When they finally arrived home, Nia carried Amina to her bed, tucking her in with gentle hands. Amina's eyes closed, exhaustion taking hold once more. Nia sat beside her, stroking her hair, her heart heavy with uncertainty. In the days following the ceremony, Amina seemed to have turned a corner. The pallor in her cheeks gave way to a faint flush of color, and the deep lines of pain that had marred her young face softened. Nia watched her daughter closely, a flicker of hope sparking in the darkness of her despair. For the first time in weeks, Amina smiled, a small, weak smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Look," Mama Amina whispered one morning, her voice no longer a strained whisper but something resembling its old self. She held up a crayon, the purple one she used to draw with before all of this had started. "I want to draw today." Nia's heart swelled with cautious optimism. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she replied, blinking back tears. She fetched a piece of paper and watched as Amina began to draw, her tiny hands moving slowly but purposefully across the page. Each stroke was like a thread of hope, weaving through the despair that had settled in their home. For a brief moment, it was as if a miracle had occurred. Nia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the ritual had worked. that whatever dark force had gripped her daughter was finally releasing her. They spent the day together in a way they hadn't in so long, Nia reading Amina's favorite stories, and Amina listening with a look of contentment on her face. But the respite was fleeting. That night, Nia awoke to the sound of Amina's cries, piercing through the veil of sleep and dragging her back to harsh reality. She rushed to her daughter's room, her heart pounding in her chest. Amina was curled up in bed, clutching her stomach, her face twisted in agony. "Mama, it hurts," she gasped, her eyes wide with terror. Nia's heart sank. "Oh no, not again," she whispered, her voice trembling. She gathered Amina into her arms, feeling the heat radiating off her small body. Amina's skin was clammy, and her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. Nia looked down and froze. Blood. It was seeping through Amina's pajama pants, staining the sheets in a dark, ominous red. Nia's mind went blank, the world narrowing to that single, horrific sight. "God, no," Nia choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Not again." She acted on instinct, grabbing her phone and dialing for an ambulance. The operator's voice was a distant hum in her ear as she barked out the address, trying to stay calm, trying not to let the terror overwhelm her. Amina was slipping away, and all Nia could think was how she had failed her, how she had let this happen again. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it felt like an eternity. They rushed Amina to the hospital, with Nia close behind, her hands shaking as she held her daughter's limp hand. The ride was a blur of flashing lights and sirens, a cacophony that echoed the chaos inside Nia's mind. At the hospital, a team of doctors whisked Amina away, leaving Nia standing alone in the hallway. She felt like she was suffocating, the walls closing in around her as panic clawed at her throat. She wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the torrent of emotions building inside her, but all she could do was wait. Wait. She was taken to a waiting room, where the minutes dragged by like hours. Nurses came and went, their faces set in grim masks of concentration. Nia wanted to grab one of them, to demand answers, but she knew it was useless. She was powerless here, at the mercy of forces she didn't understand. A doctor finally approached, his expression grave. "Mrs. Chikwi, your daughter is in critical condition," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "She's lost a significant amount of blood. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her." Nia nodded numbly, the words washing over her without meaning. Critical condition. Lost a significant amount of blood. They were phrases that should have been frightening, but she was beyond fear now. All that was left was a hollow emptiness, a void where hope had once been. She was allowed to see Amina briefly, just a glimpse before they took her into surgery. Nia stood at the edge of the bed, looking down at her daughter's pale face. Amina was so still, so quiet, her breathing shallow and labored. It was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Nia reached out, touching Amina's hand. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I'm here. Please, please don't leave me." She was led back to the waiting room, where she sank into a chair, her head in her hands. She could barely breathe, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a vice. This was her fault, all of it. She had brought Amina to that healer, had subjected her to that ritual, thinking it would save her. And now her daughter was paying the price. Hours passed, the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds, a cruel reminder of time slipping through her fingers. Nia couldn't move, couldn't think. All she could do was sit there and pray. Pray to a God she had long since stopped believing in that Amina would pull through. The doctor returned, his face a mask of professional detachment. "We've managed to stop the bleeding," he said, his tone clipped and efficient. "But she's not out of danger yet, and the next 24 hours are critical." Nia nodded. When she was finally allowed to see Amina again, she stood by her bedside, looking down at her daughter's fragile form. Amina was hooked up to a tangle of tubes and wires, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sign that she was still alive. Days passed in a blur of sterile white walls and the hum of machinery, each moment stretching on into what felt like an eternity. Nia watched over Amina, the rise and fall of her daughter's chest the only sign of life she clung to. The doctors had stabilized her, but the air was still thick with the unspoken questions that hung over them like a dark cloud. What had caused this? What had put Amina in this bed, fighting for every breath? Then came the test blood work, hormone panels, scans that took hours and left Nia sitting alone in the waiting room, her mind racing with every possible scenario. It was the end of another long day when Dr. Adeyemi approached Nia in the hallway. "We found something," he began, his voice steady but tinged with the gravity of the situation. "Amina's hormone levels are extremely elevated, progesterone and estrogen specifically far higher than what we would expect in a child her age." Nia frowned, her stomach twisting into a knot. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It suggests a hormonal imbalance," Dr. Adeyemi explained, choosing his words carefully. "Something has triggered her body to produce these hormones in excess. Given her symptoms, it's possible that she's been exposed to an external source, something that has disrupted her endocrine system." Nia's mind was a whirl of confusion. External source? Like what? "We're looking into the possibility that Amina might have ingested something that affected her hormone levels," the doctor said. "A medication, perhaps." "Have you noticed anything missing from your home? Any medications that might have been accessible to her?" Nia's heart skipped a beat. A cold realization dawning on her. Medications. Pills. Her mind flashed back to the drawer in her bedroom, the one where she kept her secrets hidden away. The emergency contraceptives. The little white pills she had come to rely on after countless reckless nights. She felt her breath hitch, a sinking feeling settling in her gut. "Emergency contraceptives," she said slowly, the words falling from her lips like stones. "I had some in my drawer." Dr. Adeyemi nodded, his expression grave. "If she ingested those, it would explain the hormone imbalance. The active ingredients in those pills could cause a child's body to go into hormonal overdrive." Nia's knees buckled, and she reached out for the wall to steady herself. The room seemed to spin around her, the doctor's words echoing in her head. She felt sick, a cold wave of nausea washing over her. It was her fault, all of it. She had left those pills within reach, thinking nothing of the danger they posed. She had been too caught up in her own misery, too focused on numbing her pain to consider the consequences. "I need to check," Nia murmured, her voice hollow. "I need to see if they're still there." Dr. Adeyemi nodded. "Please do. We need to know how much she might have taken to assess the full extent of the impact on her body." Nia stumbled out of the hospital, her mind a jumbled mess of fear and guilt. She drove home in a daze, barely aware of the road in front of her. Her thoughts were consumed by the realization that she had been the architect of her daughter's suffering. The pills. She had left them there, in plain sight, thinking nothing of it. When she arrived home, she made a beeline for the bedroom, her hands shaking as she yanked open the drawer. The small box that had once held the emergency contraceptives lay open, its contents missing. She rifled through the drawer frantically, searching for something, anything that would prove her wrong, that would show this was all some horrible mistake. But it was empty. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with the weight of her mistake. How could she have been so careless? How could she have left something so dangerous within reach of her child? Nia gathered herself enough to return to the hospital, the weight of the empty box like a leaden burden in her hands. Dr. Adeyemi met her in the hallway, his eyes narrowing as he took in her ashen face. "It's gone," Nia said, her voice trembling. "The pills, they're gone." The doctor nodded solemnly. "Thank you for confirming," he said gently. "We need to adjust our treatment plan to address the hormonal imbalance caused by the ingestion." Nia could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, one of her own making. She followed the doctor to Amina's room, where her daughter lay, still unconscious, still hooked up to a myriad of machines that beeped and whirred. "We'll begin hormone therapy to try and counteract the effects, Dr. Adeyemi explained. "It's going to be a long process, but we're hopeful. Hopeful." The word felt foreign to Nia now, a distant concept she could barely grasp. How could there be hope when she had been the one to poison her own child? She sat by Amina's bedside, taking her daughter's hand in her own. It was so small, so fragile. And Nia felt a fresh wave of tears well up in her eyes. "Mama?" Amina's voice was a weak whisper, her eyelids fluttering open. Nia's heart leapt into her throat. "Amina." "Baby," she breathed, her voice shaking. "I'm here. I'm right here." Amina's eyes, glassy with fatigue and confusion, searched her mother's face. "Mama, I'm sorry. I was so hungry. I didn't mean to." Nia shook her head, choking back a sob. "No, sweetheart. It's not your fault. It's mine. I should have been there. I should have." She couldn't finish, the words strangling her as she tried to force them out. Amina closed her eyes again, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I thought they were candy," she whispered. "I didn't know." Nia's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. This was her doing, her neglect. Her selfishness, her carelessness had led to this. She had failed her daughter in the most fundamental way a mother could. She had left her to fend for herself, and Amina had paid the price. As the days passed, the doctors began treatment to balance Amina's hormones. Her color returned, the pain lessened. Weeks turned into months, each day passing like a slow-motion reel of cautious hope and incremental progress. Amina's body gradually mended under the vigilant care of the doctors. The hormone treatments worked to bring her levels back to normal, and the constant monitoring ensured that any fluctuation was immediately addressed. Nia sat by her bedside every single day, watching with a mix of guilt and gratitude as her little girl began to bloom again. Nia was no longer the disheveled woman who had once stumbled through life in a fog of alcohol and fleeting encounters. Sitting there, she made silent promises to Amina, vows of change that filled the long hours of waiting. She vowed to become a mother her daughter could depend on. A mother who was present, sober, and fully aware. The weight of her past mistakes was a burden she would carry, but it was also a reminder of what she could never allow to happen again. When the day finally came for them to return home, Nia felt an overwhelming mix of relief and trepidation. The hospital, sterile and impersonal as it was, had become a place of healing and transformation. Now they were stepping back into the world outside, into a life that needed rebuilding from the ground up. She held Amina's hand as they walked through the hospital doors into the crisp autumn air. It was as if they were stepping into a new season, not just in nature, but in their lives. Amina glanced up at her mother, a soft smile on her face, and Nia's heart swelled. Her daughter was still fragile, still recovering, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a resilience born from enduring the unthinkable. Returning to their home was a sobering experience. The house was exactly as they had left it, the empty bottles still stuffed into the trash, the bedroom in disarray from Nia's nights of neglect. It was a time capsule of everything that had gone wrong. As Nia looked around, she felt a surge of determination. This was not the environment she wanted for Amina. This was not the life she would let her daughter return to. That very night, Nia began to make changes. She cleared out the liquor cabinet, pouring each bottle down the drain with a sense of finality. It wasn't easy, every part of her body screamed for the familiar numbness that alcohol provided, but she resisted. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing away the stains of her former life, creating a space that felt fresh, open, and full of possibility. Amina watched her mother with curious eyes, sensing the shift but not quite understanding it. "What are you doing, Mama?" she asked, her voice still soft, but now carrying an underlying strength. "Cleaning up, sweetheart," Nia replied, pausing to look at her daughter. "We're starting over. A fresh start. Just you and me." As the days passed, Nia made it a point to spend as much time with Amina as possible. They cooked meals together, simple but healthy, and shared stories at the dinner table. Nia began teaching Amina about her body, about how to care for herself. She approached the topic gently, explaining how the pills she had mistaken for candy had affected her. Amina listened intently, absorbing each word with the seriousness of someone far beyond her years. "It's important to know what you're putting into your body," Nia said one evening, as they sat together on the couch, flipping through a children's book about health and nutrition. "And to always ask questions if you're not sure about something." Amina nodded thoughtfully. "I know now, Mama," she said. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Nia felt a pang of guilt, but pushed it aside. "It wasn't your fault, honey," she assured her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It was my job to keep you safe, and I failed. But I'm here now, and I promise I'll never let anything like that happen again." Their relationship began to heal, slowly but surely. Nia learned to listen, truly listen to Amina's needs and concerns. They established routines, things that gave Amina a sense of stability and security. Bedtime stories, walks in the park, even something as simple as brushing their teeth together every night became rituals that bonded them. Nia also sought help for herself. She knew she couldn't fully be there for Amina if she didn't address her own demons. She started attending therapy, working through the layers of guilt, grief, and the self-destructive patterns that had nearly cost her everything. It was a long, arduous process, but with each session, she felt a little stronger, a little more capable of being the mother Amina deserved. Nia also arranged for Amina to see a child psychologist, someone who could help her process what had happened. The first few sessions were difficult. Amina was reluctant to open up, and the trauma of her ordeal was still fresh. But slowly, with patience and gentle guidance, Amina began to talk. She spoke of the fear, the pain, the confusion, and the sense of being abandoned. Nia sat with her during these sessions, holding her hand, tears in her eyes as she listened to her daughter's raw, honest feelings. In time, Amina began to reclaim parts of her childhood that had been lost. She returned to school cautiously at first, but with growing confidence. Nia watched as she made friends, joined in on activities, and started to laugh again, real, joyous laughter that filled their home with light. It was a sound Nia had feared she might never hear again, and it was the sweetest music to her ears. Every day was a reminder of how precious life was, how easily it could be shattered, and how painstakingly it could be rebuilt. Nia remained vigilant, always aware of Amina's needs, always ready to step in if something seemed off. She knew she couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the mistakes that had brought them to this point, but she could shape the future, and that was exactly what she intended to do. As they stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Nia took Amina's hand in hers. "You know I love you, right?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. Amina looked up at her, eyes bright with understanding. "I know, Mama. I love you too." It was a simple exchange, but it held the weight of all they had been through. They had come out the other side, scar-red but not broken, and with each passing day they were building something new, something stronger. A life where love and care were the foundation, where they could face the future together, hand in hand. The story reflects a powerful lesson about the importance of being present and attentive in the lives of our loved ones, especially children. It serves as a painful reminder that neglect, whether intentional or unintentional, can have devastating consequences. The mother's journey from self-destruction to redemption is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love and responsibility. It highlights that while mistakes are inevitable, the path to healing starts with taking accountability, seeking help, and making deliberate efforts to change. The bond between a parent and child is sacred, and nurturing that bond with care, love, and attention is paramount. This story also emphasizes that hope and forgiveness are powerful forces that can mend even the deepest wounds. O Allah, the most merciful and compassionate, I turn to you in humility and ask for your forgiveness for the times I have been neglectful or distant from those I love. Grant me the strength to be the parent, the guardian, and the person who listens with care, loves with sincerity, and acts with responsibility. O Allah, guide me on the path of redemption, and give me the wisdom to make amends for my past mistakes. Protect my children and all those in my care from harm, and envelop them in your infinite mercy and protection. Bless our families with unity, love, and understanding, and let us always be a source of comfort and safety for one another. Remove from our hearts the burdens of guilt and regret, and replace them with the light of hope and the strength to build a better future.